Give it up for Paul.
Cool. So I'm going to keep this relatively short. And the background for doing this, I was chatting with the organizers, and just after this, we'll have Anthony from Vida.RNA kind of giving a deep dive. And the fundamental question that I'm going to try and answer just with the next couple of slides, which I skipped this morning, if you remember this morning's presentation, is really just to actually give a super brief primer on how IP NFTs work and how IPTs work, and kind of what's happening in that space from a funding perspective. Because often people ask, okay, but how do these bio-DAOs and these different DeSci organizations actually accrue value? So in the next couple of slides, we're going to dive into that. So this is where we left things off this morning. You have one individual DAO, which is VitaDAO. And then in VitaDAO, we have assets such as VitaFast or Vida.RNA. This was the first project with Copenhagen. So these are all IP NFTs. IP NFTs represent a one-on-one ownership, like an NFT. And then these above are IPTs. So these are tradable ERC20 tokens. So we're going to start with IP NFTs, which we really see as like real-world Lego blocks for DeSci. We've seen in the past that real-world assets on Ethereum have actually gained a lot of traction. So I think BlackRock, announced a $100 million on-chain real-world asset fund, where they've started. Actually, does anyone know? Am I correct with 100 million, or was it more? Nobody knows. So a $100 million fund on Ethereum that invests into real-world assets. And we've seen organizations such as Centrifuge, for instance, or others that are really actually building out a real-world asset tokenization portfolio. And so IP NFTs for us represent a similar thing. So an IP NFT is a new Web3 native legal primitive that moves intellectual property, IP, on-chain. And IP NFTs are programmable, meaning you could programmatically define royalties or ownership. You can grant ownership, for instance, or access rights to a different set of people. You can kind of think of them as like a decentralized, tokenized Google Drive. That's the simplest way to think about it. And in that Google Drive, in each and every one of them, you have a real-world legal contract. They're transactable, like NFTs. You can send them around. Remember that typically, if you out-license a piece of biotech IP from a university, or you exchange it between entities, so one company does a licensing agreement with the other, that can take many, many months. In some cases, we once had a 12-month negotiation with Tel Aviv University simply around this legal agreement. And so what IP NFTs do is they enable the transfer of IP within 5 minutes. Once you agreed on the transfer agreement and kind of the legal owners are known. That's a second really important thing. IP NFTs are not cannot be owned by anonymous entities. So you need to know the other contract party. They're actually one-to-one sponsorship agreements typically. They're transactable, they can be highly liquid, we'll get to that, and they're rich in data. So the researcher, the research team, the company that works on them kind of continuously uploads the research data, and then other people in the DAO or in the community that is funding this can look at the research data. And this is actually fundamentally the infrastructure that Molecule provides to kind of enable decentralized science, to really be real. So this is kind of a brief anatomy. You have a legal contract with the identities, the name and physical address of the entity, wallet addresses, transaction half of the signed transaction, the actual deal terms, and the IP details. That gets attached to a smart contract, which gets attached to a metadata JSON on Ethereum and then is encrypted. So all of the data associated with this, you can have some of the data be public, but typically all of the IP and data needs to be encrypted, and then it's kind of only shared within a community of people who have kind of entered an NDA, for instance, or kind of a development agreement. So the cool thing that this does is you can now create these kind of semi-open, semi-closed micro communities that can together develop an asset. So for instance, we can now token gate access. We can say only VitaDAO token holders or token holders in another DAO can have access to this specific IP. And then from IP NFTs are typically today normally held by a DAO. Early on, as we actually developed Molecule, we had this kind of vision that this is when NFTs got really big, that cool, anyone could hold one of these IP NFTs, anyone can fund science. And while that seems cool as a first idea, it's actually pretty impractical because typically you need a really well incentivized sponsor, like one entity, like a DAO, or like a company, or yeah, you need an entity that can actually drive the research project forward. Because there's a lot of different steps to take into consideration, meaning that if some random person funds one-to-one a research project, they may simply not know what to do, right? They funded the project, project's worth 200K for instance, but then do they have the qualification to actually develop that and drive it forward? And so the next step for IP on chain, in our view, are IPTs. So IPT simply stands for intellectual property tokens. And so now these can actually be held by individuals. And these are fungible governance tokens around an IP NFT. So you can kind of have the IP NFT that consists of various components, the intellectual property, a patent, a license, a research agreement, that forms an IP NFT. And then you can essentially tokenize that IP NFT into IPTs. And I'll briefly walk through a couple of examples where this has been done. So IPTs can now be exchanged for work, right? So I can say, hey, whichever researcher completes the following steps around this research project gets 1%. So we can now create little bounties around a specific research project that actually enable modularized drug development. This can also cut down the cost of drug development, meaning we don't need to pay everything in cash, but we can actually have different entities that are incentivized to co-develop a specific research project. Can be exchanged for funding, that's the most basic use case, and for contributions. I just spoke about that. In one of the first ever IPTs that we generated around this, the university actually, they got 5% of the tokens, and then I think the researcher got, Oliver, you would know this better. How much did the researcher get? What? The researcher got 4% of the tokens. We got an email from him, I think in the weeks after it was tokenized, and he said, well, he's never made this much money in his life. And he joked that he would now, I think, go on vacation somewhere. No, but you actually have to imagine, for these researchers, I should actually show that email on a slide, it would be funny. With his permission, of course. And for these researchers, this is in some cases, is life-changing money. But it's also not like they don't want to access the liquidity, but still, in most cases, a researcher never gets any ownership or upside in the things that they create, or if they do get it, they have to leave the university forever. They have to become a founder, which is a really, really tough journey. And this is something that we realized early on in building this. Many researchers are not fit to be founders. Like we force them to become biotech CEOs. Some of them want this, obviously, but many are not set up for that. And actually, by removing them from academia, you massively bloat the costs. So now, if you have to create a biotech company, set up your own lab, of course you have to raise millions. When in many cases, we call this a killer experiment. A killer experiment costs 100 to 500K to prove whether the thing works or not. And so IPTs are really designed around successful killer experiments, right? So an IP NFT funds the initial experiment. If that experiment works, then we start tokenizing it into IPTs. Because at this point, you can be relatively sure that the IP will become more and more valuable. And so what's really cool is I think IPTs enable open source collaboration without losing commercial viability. This is super important. This is not true open science, because true open science doesn't work in biotech. Like as soon as you publish, if you were a scientist that writes a blog post about their newest discovery, puts that online, that thing forever loses commercial viability because it can't be patented anymore because you have prior art. And so with IPTs, you can enable open source collaboration, forms of open science, without losing that. I don't want to steal your show, Anthony. So I'll say something very briefly just about the IP NFT and how it was formed. And then Anthony's going to inform us deeply about the actual... Should I skip them, Anthony? Yeah? Okay. Are you going to talk about the newest price action or probably not? Okay, yeah, I'll show that. Okay, so in May 2023, the Artan Bio IP NFT was first funded. And then in January 2024, VDAO decided to tokenize the project based on already seeing positive data coming out of this. And then this is what the IP NFT actually looks like on chain. You can kind of look at the assignment agreement, the research agreement. You can look at various forms of on-chain data, the current valuation. And then this is the initial tokenomics setup, if any of you are interested. And in June 2024, the Vita RNA sale for this IPT raised $300,000 from over 50 VitaDAO token holders by selling 20% of the supply to Vita token holders. So you have to be a Vita token holder to participate in these kind of initial offerings. So it's not fully public. You have to be a Vita token holder, and then you have pro rata rights based on how many tokens you have. And this raised 83 ETH, which at the time was $300,000. Yeah, this was what the initial crowd sale page looked like. And then I think about a month later, the asset was put on chain. So a DEX Uniswap liquidity pool was launched in June and stabilized at roughly 3 million FTV, which is relatively accurate for an super early stage biotech valuation. Following this, we had a first data drop. You can kind of see here, this was a VitaRNA data drop organized, I think, by Alex Dobrin and together with Anthony and Michael Torres. This was only accessible to VitaRNA token holders. So now again, you're creating a micro community. This was here. And then there was a further CRO data release that Michael Torres got really excited about. You can see it got 63 likes, lots of reshares. People were saying, cool, this is really an early form of DeSci. And then the token price increased to now an 8.5 million valuation, which I think is really significant. Like, this is the first time, this is a longevity gene therapy, by the way. It's the first time that something like this is being tokenized and essentially traded in the public. And the price in the community directly responds to positive data emerging or negative data emerging. So Molecule also last month launched Catalyst, which is essentially a scalable platform to tokenize early stage science. Since August, so since this has been launched, projects have raised around 130 ETH already from over 100 different participants. This is one project that deals with antibodies for Alzheimer's disease. It is with Daniel Barr from the Tel Aviv University. This is currently raising. It's currently raised about 30 ETH. VitaDAO is one of the largest funders. And then here, this project is with the University of Zurich and University of Basel in Switzerland. It's for 100% of the IP in both cases. So as soon as this bar fills, essentially the project coordinators begin negotiating with the universities. There's kind of a pre-negotiated set of terms, but then kind of once you have the money in the hand, that's when that group approaches the researcher and the work is out-licensed. This was the first time that multiple DAOs funded a project. Also in Alzheimer's, Transfidelity is also an Alzheimer's project. And was co-funded by Cerebrum DAO. Cerebrum DAO is taking the lead sponsor role. Cerebrum DAO, VitaDAO, and BeakerDAO. Cool. Increasingly at VitaDAO or at other DAOs, one thing that we ask us is, like, why work with universities when we can actually come up with IP within our community? VitaRNA is also a good example, which is not, VitaRNA is not based with a specific university. We've nicknamed this project Vitamycin. So rapamycin is one of the most promising longevity interventions that we know. However, rapamycin is not safe for widespread daily oral use. And so several pharmaceutical companies, including Novartis, have actually developed what are rapamycin analogs. We call them rapalogs. And there's a current project in development that is going to develop our own rapalog. Or multiple rapalogs. And this is actually in collaboration with LabDAO. So LabDAO is proposing to develop these rapamycin analogs through its platform. And in partnership with Molecule and BeakerDAO and VitaDAO, the underlying IP again would be tokenized, where LabDAO contributes the work and the drug discovery infrastructure, BeakerDAO contributes funding, and VitaDAO could contribute data and essentially community validation. So again, you could have a similar thing here with, as Adam Gries suggested, where you can now use actually tokens in this particular research project, which is for a novel rapamycin analog, for trial recruitment, for instance. Cool, and with that, that was the quick intro to IPTs. I think we're gonna have it added to Anthony, unless there's any questions. Yes. Great to get some sense of it. 100%. Are you asking that, or just is it a comment? Yeah. Yeah. So I think the limiting factor is that you only, I think, want to IPT something, or at least that's our design principle at the moment, that is relatively predictable quality. It's a question of how, to what extent you want to permission a system like that, or rather have everything completely liquid from the get-go. I think if you have everything liquid and it's unpermissioned, I could foresee issues. I could foresee issues. And so given the permission nature, maybe 20, I think 20 to 30 at the end of 2025 would be a good number. So VitaDAO maybe having 5 to 10, and then the other DAOs potentially having 1 or 2 or 3 each. Because you have to see, it takes them a while to develop a pipeline, fund a project initially, and then for us, the tokenization part is typically always the second step, unless a project is quite mature. I also think we'll start seeing more IPTs by companies. As I said earlier, there's a huge kind of liquidity crunch in the biotech space, meaning that it's very difficult at the moment for early stage to even mid-stage companies to raise financing. And so there's a lot of assets in those companies that are really good assets, but the companies can't raise any equity financing. And so actually doing IPT-based, asset-based financing could be really attractive to those companies. So I'd also really love to see a couple larger potentially raises like that, where you also get traditional biotech investors potentially joining it. I think that would be super interesting. And then maybe as a last point, because I know it's the last question, what would be super awesome, something that I really want to build is you want a CoinGecko-like, or we call it CoinMarketCap, whatever, Masari-like view, exactly to see what are early assets that are being minted on chain, what's coming in, who are the researchers working on it, how is that progressing into an IP NFT, those IP NFTs that are ongoing, which ones are likely to become IPTs, can I find a way to invest into them early if I like them? So actually getting into much more transparency and a blend between a data view, so like data and financial data, like scientific data and financial data combined. I think at this point we might see kind of the birth of like a new user group, which is a DeSci degen. I think we're probably about a year away from systems like that actually really sprouting with activity. Maybe half a year, depending on. I hope earlier, but there's time to build. I don't think we need to rush any of this, but I think DeSci Summit next year would be epic.
Patience. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you so much, Max.